They fought until their last breath, swore never to bow to Rome, and turned mountains into fortresses. To some, they were heroes, to others, terrorists. But who were the Zealots, the rebels who challenged the greatest empire in the world? And how far were they willing to go to protect their faith and freedom? In first-century Judea, Rome ruled with an iron fist. Abusive taxes, oppression, and the constant presence of Roman soldiers made daily life unbearable. It was in this environment that a group emerged willing to do anything: the Zealots. They didn't seek negotiations or concessions. For them, the only path was rebellion, direct confrontation with imperial power, even if it meant the end of everything. Imagine a city under siege, men and women who would rather die than live under foreign rule. What drives someone to pick up arms knowing they are at a disadvantage? What motivates a people to sacrifice their very existence in the name of an ideal? The Zealots were not just fighters. They were living symbols of resistance, ready to spill the last drop of blood for their faith and their land. But the Zealots also divided opinions. To Rome, they were dangerous fanatics, enemies of order and civilization. To the Jews, they were both liberators and a threat, as their extreme actions led to the destruction of Jerusalem and the fall of the temple. The story of the Zealots is full of contradictions. Were they heroes or villains? Martyrs or responsible for the end of an era? And what were the desperate battles that defined their fate? In today's video, you'll discover the story of the Zealots, who these rebels were, what their strategies were, and how their fierce struggle against Rome triggered an unprecedented tragedy. We'll explore the Siege of Masada, the internal conflicts among the Jews, and the lasting impact of this resistance on the history of the Middle East. If you want to dive into the most dramatic moments of ancient history and discover how ordinary men challenged the greatest empire in the world, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Here, we retell the great stories of the past with all the details, so they will never be forgotten. In the scorching deserts of first-century Judea, a single spark ignited a wildfire of resistance. The Roman Empire's domination over the region was unrelenting. Crushing taxes, harsh laws, and the constant presence of foreign soldiers made daily life unbearable for the Jewish people. Imagine waking each morning knowing your labor, your freedom, and even your culture belonged to someone else. It was not just economic or political oppression. It was a calculated attempt to strip away identity, faith, and dignity. The Romans saw themselves as bringers of civilization. But for the Jews of Judea, they were nothing more than conquerors choking out a nation's spirit. Amid this suffocating climate, a leader emerged with an idea so radical it would shake the region to its core. Judas the Galilean, often called the ideological father of the Zealots, declared that only God should be king. This wasn't just a religious statement. It was an outright rejection of Roman rule and everything it stood for. Judas inspired a new kind of resistance, one that refused compromise or negotiation. Where other Jewish groups, like the Pharisees, sought accommodation, and the Sadducees tried to maintain peace through diplomacy, the Zealots took a different path: total defiance. To them, submission to Rome was worse than death, and their actions would soon reflect that belief. The Zealots didn't rise as simple fanatics, as their Roman enemies later claimed. They were ordinary people pushed to extraordinary measures. Farmers, craftsmen, fathers, and sons who decided that rebellion was their only choice. Their resolve was unshakable, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet, what drives a group of people to embrace violence when survival seems almost impossible? Was it desperation, or was it something deeper? A commitment to ideals worth dying for? As their influence grew, so did the complexity of their role in history, leading to a bitter divide within their own people. Some Jews celebrated the Zealots as saviors fighting for freedom. Others feared their extremism would bring ruin to everyone. And they were right to worry. The Zealots' willingness to shed blood, even their own, set them on a collision course with their fellow Jews and the unstoppable machine of Rome. But as their influence spread through guerrilla warfare and targeted assassinations, the question remained: Were they fighting for liberation, or were they pushing their people closer to destruction? The Zealots' actions would soon expose the cracks in their movement and the contradictions of their mission. Were they heroes or dangerous extremists? And what happens when the people you fight to save begin to turn against you? For the Zealots, there was no middle ground. Either you resisted Rome, or you were part of the problem. This black and white worldview became their guiding principle and their greatest flaw. At first, they were seen as bold warriors, using unconventional tactics to strike fear into Roman hearts. The Sicarii, a faction of Zealots, became infamous for their deadly precision. Armed with small daggers hidden beneath their cloaks, they would target collaborators and Roman officials in broad daylight, vanishing into the crowd before anyone could react. For Rome, these acts were barbaric. For the Zealots, they were justice. However, this growing extremism created fractures within Judean society. Many Jews admired their courage but condemned their methods, fearing that open rebellion would invite catastrophic retaliation from Rome. And indeed, it did. The Zealots' unyielding resolve often escalated conflicts that could have been avoided. During the Great Jewish Revolt, tensions boiled over into civil war within Judea itself. Different Jewish factions fought not just against Rome, but against each other, each claiming to fight for the true vision of their people. Amid this chaos, ordinary citizens were trapped in a storm of violence and destruction, caught between loyalty to their faith and a desperate desire for peace. Rome, of course, exploited these divisions. To the Roman governors and generals, the Zealots were nothing more than terrorists, violent insurgents disrupting the empire's vision of order. To them, peace was simple: submit or perish. Yet, the Zealots refused to accept that peace came at the cost of their freedom. This refusal defined them, but it also doomed them. Their unwavering resistance led to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, a loss so devastating it would reshape Jewish history forever. But even as their world crumbled, the Zealots never abandoned their fight. They retreated to the deserts, turning places like the fortress of Masada into symbols of last-stand defiance. And it's here, in the barren cliffs overlooking the Dead Sea, that their story reached its most tragic and unforgettable chapter. How far could they go to preserve their ideals? And when facing certain death, what choice does a people have left? The answer lies in Masada, where the Zealots would make a decision so final, it would echo through history. But what happened during that final siege? And why does the name Masada still carry so much weight today? Perched high above the barren Judean desert, Masada wasn't just a fortress. It was a symbol of defiance carved into the mountains. For the Zealots, it became their last stronghold after years of bloody rebellion. With 960 men, women, and children inside its walls, Masada stood like an island in a sea of Roman soldiers. From below, the Roman general Flavius Silva could see the fortress towering cliffs, seemingly impossible to conquer. Yet, Rome did not tolerate defiance, and Silva was determined to crush the Zealots, no matter the cost. The Siege of Masada was as much a psychological battle as it was physical. For months, Roman soldiers toiled under the sun, building a colossal siege ram against the cliffs. It was a feat of engineering so remarkable that it still stands today. From atop Masada, the Zealots watched as their fate slowly crept closer. Each stone laid was another step toward their destruction. But surrender was never an option. To the Zealots, captivity meant dishonor, slavery, and the loss of everything they held sacred. Freedom was not negotiable. It was a principle worth dying for. Inside the fortress, tensions grew with each passing day. Imagine the fear and desperation of a father watching his family's fate sealed by the approaching Roman legions. Or the resolve of a mother who understood that survival under Roman rule would mean losing her children to a life of slavery. As the Roman siege ram neared completion, the Zealots faced the unthinkable: to submit and live in chains, or to take their fate into their own hands. Led by Eleazar ben Yair, their leader, the Zealots made a chilling choice, one that would forever define their legacy. On the final night, as the Romans prepared to breach the walls, the Zealots gathered. They knew the fortress would fall by morning. Rather than surrender, they chose death. Families said their goodbyes. Fathers comforted children, and the men of Masada carried out a pact of collective suicide. When the Romans entered the fortress at dawn, they expected to find a fierce battle. Instead, they were met with silence and a harrowing scene. A fortress filled with the lifeless bodies of those who refused to be conquered. The fall of Masada marked the end of the Zealots' rebellion, but it raised haunting questions that still linger today. Were they heroes who died free, or extremists who made a tragic choice? And why has Masada's story endured for thousands of years, turning it into a symbol that transcends time? Though the Zealots' bodies fell at Masada, their story did not die with them. The destruction of Jerusalem and the fall of Masada marked the end of an era for the Jewish people. Without a homeland, they were scattered across the world in what would come to be known as the Jewish diaspora. But even in defeat, the Zealots left an indelible mark, not just on Jewish history, but on the universal concept of resistance. Their willingness to fight, even against impossible odds, turned them into symbols of defiance and sacrifice. Over the centuries, the story of Masada became a rallying cry for those who refused to submit to oppression. For some, the Zealots are remembered as heroes who fought for freedom in the face of tyranny. For others, they are a cautionary tale of how extremism can lead to destruction. This dual legacy keeps their story alive, endlessly debated, reinterpreted, and studied. Even today, Masada holds deep meaning. Israeli soldiers, for example, take an oath at the ruins of Masada, swearing, "Masada shall not fall again." The fortress is no longer just a historical site. It's a symbol of survival and resilience. But the legacy of the Zealots doesn't stop there. Their actions and their defiance have echoes throughout history. Think of every oppressed group that stood against an overwhelming power, every rebellion that sought freedom despite the odds. The Zealot story raises a profound question about humanity. What price are we willing to pay for our ideals? Is freedom worth sacrificing everything? These questions are not relics of the past. They are alive in struggles for justice and liberation around the world today. And yet, the contradictions remain. Were the Zealots martyrs or extremists? Did their rebellion pave the way for future movements of resistance? Or did it condemn their people to unnecessary suffering? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, a blend of heroism and tragedy, vision and destruction. Their fight was not just against Rome, but against the very limits of what it means to resist. As we reflect on the Zealots and their place in history, we are left with a final question. Was their sacrifice a necessary stand for freedom, or could there have been another way? And if faced with the same choices, what would we do? If you're fascinated by the Zealots' resistance, you won't want to miss the story of Viriato, the warrior who defied Rome's war machine. Just like the Zealots, Viriato fought against overwhelming odds, using guerrilla tactics to strike fear into the heart of the empire. But was he a hero or an extremist? Click here to discover how this shepherd turned strategist outsmarted Roman legions in the rugged terrains of the Iberian Peninsula. You'll see how his fight for freedom reshaped the battlefield and inspired future resistance movements.